Tonight, we're going to explore a case that spans more than a decade. A case that begins in the quiet academic world of a respected professor and ends inside a hotel room near one of Michigan's busiest airports. Two different scenes, two different victims, 5 years apart. Yet both were stalked, attacked, and murdered by the same man. A man who lived an ordinary life, but hid an extraordinary darkness. This is the story of Margarette Eby, Nancy Ludwig, and the silent predator who hunted them both. Chapter 1: The Gatehouse. It was November 1986 in Flint, Michigan. Winter had begun to creep in, covering the city in its usual gray stillness. At the University of Michigan Flint, Professor Margarette Eby was a respected, admired figure. Intelligent, elegant, and known for her kindness, she carried herself with a calm dignity that made people remember her. She lived part-time in the gatehouse of the historic Charles Stewart Mott estate, a small, quaint building tucked away behind rows of trees. It was the kind of place that looked peaceful from the outside, almost cozy, surrounded by silence. No one knows if she felt uneasy that night. No one knows if she sensed someone watching her. But what we do know is that Margarette entered that gatehouse and never walked back out. The next morning, when she didn't show up for work, colleagues grew concerned. She wasn't the type to take days off suddenly. Someone eventually went to check on her. Inside the gatehouse, they discovered a scene of brutality none of them had been prepared for. Margarette Eby had been raped and murdered. The attack was violent and personal. Investigators searched the small home carefully and found two clues: a bloody fingerprint on a bathroom faucet and semen left behind by the killer. But in 1986, DNA meant very little. The technology wasn't ready. The fingerprint wasn't matched to anyone. There were no clear suspects, no witnesses, no clear motive. And the case slowly slipped into silence. The file closed, but the darkness behind it remained. Chapter 2: Another woman, another city. 5 years passed. Then, in 1991, the killer surfaced again. This time, the scene was a Hilton hotel in Romulus, Michigan, near the Detroit Metro Airport. Travelers came and went constantly, and the hotel often hosted flight crews, including 47-year-old flight attendant Nancy Ludwig. Nancy was known for her warm personality, her professionalism, and the calm she brought to long, exhausting flights. She had spent years traveling, staying in countless hotels, following the routines of aviation life. On November 9th, Nancy checked into her room for the night. She walked the hallway alone, carrying her bags, most likely tired and ready for rest. But unknown to her, she was being watched. Sometime after she settled into her room, the killer attacked. The assault was swift, vicious, and horrifyingly similar to the murder of Margarette Eby. Nancy Ludwig was raped and then murdered with extreme force. The scene bore unmistakable signs of control and rage. Yet again, semen was found, but DNA science was still too limited. Investigators couldn't identify the man responsible. Just like Eby's case, Nancy Ludwig's murder went cold. Two brutal attacks, 5 years apart, two families left with no answers, and a killer who remained invisible. Chapter 3: A Son's Warning. Not everyone moved on. Margarette Eby's son, grieving and searching for answers, read about Nancy Ludwig's murder. The method of attack, the brutality, the similarities, they struck him immediately. Something deep inside him whispered that this was the same man who had killed his mother. He reached out to police. He told investigators that the two crimes felt connected, that the same killer had struck again. But at the time, it sounded far-fetched to law enforcement. Different cities, different victims, no evidence linking the crimes. They listened politely, but ultimately dismissed his theory. He wasn't a detective. He wasn't an expert. He was simply a son who noticed what the professionals didn't. For years, his warning went unacknowledged. Meanwhile, the killer lived freely somewhere in Michigan, blending into everyday life, confident that he had left no trace that could ever reveal who he truly was. Chapter 4. Science wakes the dead. Years passed. And then, quietly, something changed. DNA technology advanced. Laboratories gained new abilities. Old evidence, things once considered useless, began to speak. With these scientific breakthroughs, investigators revisited cold cases. Both the Eby and Ludwig cases were among them. When the semen samples were retested, the results came back with chilling clarity. The samples matched perfectly. Both women had been assaulted by the same man. Margarette Eby's son had been right all along. Now, investigators needed a name. They turned back to the bloody fingerprint from the 1986 Gatehouse. In the early 2000s, that print was run through updated fingerprint databases. This time, it hit. The name that appeared stunned investigators. Jeffrey Gorton. A quiet, seemingly normal man living in Clio, Michigan. Married, employed, no significant criminal history. No signs on the surface that he was capable of anything violent. But the fingerprint didn't lie. The DNA didn't lie. And suddenly, a man who had lived unnoticed for nearly 2 decades became the prime suspect in 2 of Michigan's most chilling unsolved murders. Chapter 5. The Life of a Hidden Predator. When police began to dig into Gorton's life, they discovered something unsettling. He was not the kind of man anyone would label a threat. He wasn't volatile, didn't have a record, didn't behave in a way that made neighbors suspicious. He blended into society with ease. But behind closed doors, he harbored violent fantasies. He stalked women. He moved through Michigan watching for opportunities. And twice, he struck. Investigators concluded that his attacks weren't impulsive. He had watched both women, studied them, waited for the perfect moment. He selected his victims carefully. The forensic evidence was undeniable. The match was absolute. This was their man. In 2002, police arrested Jeffrey Gorton. Families who had waited for closure finally had a name and a face for the monster who had taken their loved ones. Chapter 6. The Trial. The court hearings were disturbing and emotional. Prosecutors laid out the evidence. The DNA linking him to both murders. The fingerprint placing him inside the gatehouse. The similarities between the 2 attacks. Jurors saw photographs, listened to testimony, and heard the scientific explanations that tied everything together. The case was overwhelming. Gorton had no believable explanation, no defense strong enough to combat the evidence. He was found guilty of the murder of Nancy Ludwig. Later, he pleaded no contest to the murder of Margarette Eby, finally bringing a long-awaited sense of justice to her family. After years of pain, the truth had finally come together. Chapter 7. Unanswered Questions. Once Gorton was behind bars, investigators began looking into other cases. The brutality of the attacks made them wonder if he had been responsible for more than just 2 murders. There were similarities between his crimes and other unsolved assaults across Michigan. There have long been suspicions that he may have harmed other women, but nothing was ever definitively proven. Still, those lingering questions hang over the case like a shadow. A man capable of such violent control rarely stops on his own. It made many investigators wonder how long Gorton had been stalking women, and how many times he came close to repeating his crimes. We may never know the full extent of his actions. Chapter 8. Justice, even after the silence. Today, Jeffrey Gorton sits in prison, serving a life sentence. A man who once moved unnoticed through daily life is now caged permanently. Margarette Eby and Nancy Ludwig, 2 women who never met, are forever linked by the horror they endured and by the evidence that finally exposed their killer. The cold cases that once seemed unsolvable were cracked open by scientific persistence and by a son who saw the truth long before anyone else did. Their stories remind us that evil rarely looks like a monster on the surface. Sometimes it looks like a neighbor, a coworker, someone blending into the landscape of everyday life. But hidden in the smallest traces, a fingerprint, a drop of DNA, are the pieces that eventually tear down the masks of even the most careful predators. And in the end, the truth surfaced long after the killer believed he was free. A reminder that justice may be delayed, but it does not vanish. Justice waits, justice watches, and justice remembers.